All right, in this video, we are going to start our implementation of adding items to the playlist. So this is a fairly involved process. We need to, first of all, validate that we support that particular URL being added. Then we have to identify which service of the URL is being added. Is it a YouTube video, a Vimeo video, whatever? And then we have to actually perform the adding by querying an API, getting details about the video, then finally adding it to the playlist, then telling everyone that it was added to the playlist, and then on the client, handling it on our store to add it to the state, and then at the end of all of that, actually creating the component to display it. So yeah, this is going to be pretty involved, and it's most likely going to be multiple videos. So let's just go ahead and do things in a sort of logical order. The first thing I'm going to do is create a validate method. So we can write that and test that really easily. So I'm going to come up here to shared validation. I'm going to create a new file called playlist.js. And I'm going to import underscore from lodash, and I'm also going to import validator from back validator. And then I'm going to go ahead and do something interesting. I'm going to say export const YouTube regexes equals array. And inside of this array, I'm going to put in regular expressions that match YouTube links so that we know if the, A, if the thing's valid at all, and B, if it's a YouTube video. And YouTube is the only service that we're going to be supporting in this series, but obviously if you wanted to support Vimeo, you would do the same process with Vimeo. Let's go ahead and write those regexes first. So I'm going to open up Chrome, and I'm going to go to regex 101. And I'm going to want to match two formats. The first format of YouTube URLs is going to be something like that. So what we want to do is we want to match it, and if it matches, we want to grab that aspect, that one thing. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing we need to do is start matching HTTP, and then I'm going to do S followed by a question mark so that the S is optional. Then colon, and then I'm going to do a slash and a slash. And to do forward slashes and regexes, we have to escape them with the backslash. Then we'll do we'll open up a group, and we'll do www backslash dot, and then question mark at the end of the group. So we'll have an optional www dot. Remember, the dot also has to be escaped because that's a regex reserved symbol, so we have to escape it with the backslash. Then we type in YouTube, followed by an escaped dot, com, followed by an escaped forward slash. So now we're on track for extracting out this data. However, the problem with this is we now need to extract that V out of there, but YouTube often does a lot of weird things. It can optionally add a bunch of additional query string parameters, like if it came from a playlist or something like that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to say dot and then followed by a star to say match anything, but match it non-greedily. So we do a question mark, and then do V equals, and then we'll follow that with a dot anything. And then just to be fancy, we'll put an end delimiter at that using the $sign. So you see this regex will match these URLs, and it'll extract this value out into a group. There's one more thing I want to do with this regex. This group right here, I'm not extracting out for any particular reason. I'm just using it to optionally match www, but I don't want it to go into my matches. So to do that, what I'm going to do is at the beginning of this group, I'm going to do question mark, colon. And what that does is it makes this a non-capturing group. I'm still grouping the characters together to optionally include www, but I'm not matching it, meaning the only match that we get out of this entire regular expression is just the information we want, which is this video ID. So with that, let's go ahead and just take this regex, copy it, get it on our clipboard, then jump back into Visual Studio and dump it right here. But of course, since it's a regex, we have to delineate it with forward slashes. And that's our first YouTube regex. Now let's write another one, because again, we need there's two formats we want to support. We want to support the long form and the short form. So what does the short form look like? Well, the short form is simply going to be that. So let's go ahead and match this. I'm going to delete everything but the HTTP // and then I'm going to go ahead and match U2 followed by a literal period followed by BE, then followed by an escaped /, and then I'm just going to literally match everything after that. And with that regex, we now have a match on just the one element of this short form. So the short form is what you would use to share YouTube video without all the extra stuff in it. It's the URL you get when you hit the share button on YouTube. So another important thing, notice how this is the only match. This means that we can use both of those regexes interchangeably, and the first and only match will only be the information we want. By the way, if you haven't seen any of my other videos, video series, regex101.com is one of my favorite websites for writing regular expressions. It's worth bookmarking this and working with it and getting used to how it works. But anyway, stuff and things. We now have the second regular expression. Let's go ahead and get that onto our clipboard, and we can close out regex 101. We don't need this anymore. And let's confirm we want to leave. Jump back into code, and I'll just dump this regex down in here, delineating with the forward slashes. So we can now validate. So I'm going to say export function validate add source URL, and I'm going to say if not underscore, or lodash rather, underscore dot sum YouTube regexes, regex goes into regex test URL, then validator error invalid URL. Of course, we actually have to instantiate the validator. That was a mistake on my part. Okay, let's actually spell that correctly. And let's actually spell this one correctly too. Now we're done. And now we can say return validator. So all I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, underscore.sum will return true if any of these predicates match. So we say if any of those regexes match, then go ahead and return true. What we could do is if we had multiple regexes, you would obviously want to combine those multiple sets of regexes anyway. You would obviously want to flatten them out into a single array of regexes. But right now we just have YouTube regexes, so I'm just going to leave it like this. Anyway, so that's our playlist validation. Let's go hook it up to the client side, because we want to do client side and server side validation. So let's open up client components, client stores, playlist.js, and let's go down here to add source, and let's actually fill this out and write this properly. The first thing we need to do, of course, is actually import our validator. So I'm going to say import validate add source from shared I always forget the name of that folder. Validation playlist. Then right here, I'm going to say const validator equals validate add source URL. If not validator is valid, then simply return our validator dot throw money. I believe that's the method that we used there. Let's go ahead and verify that with the user's login. No, we did observable throw, then message validator message. That's what we need to do. So observable throw, and then validator.message. And then if that doesn't throw, then what we're going to do is simply return this server emit action money playlist add, and then I'm going to just simply pass in space URL. So again, recall this syntax here. It's ES25 syntax. It'll create an object with the URL property set to that value. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and jump back into our browser and test this. So make sure you have this code added there. And I'll open up the playlist validator as well if you want to pause on the video. I won't be coming back to this file, so if you want to take a look at that. But with that out of the way, let's open this up and test it. So I'm going to reload because we changed some shared code. I'm going to enter a bogus username. I'm going to add an item, and I'm just going to put in garbage. And it says uncaught invalid URL, and that brings up a good point. We forgot, or rather I forgot, to catch wrap the exception being thrown. So let's jump back into code. And I'm going to close these guys out. I'm going to open up my components, components playlist toolbar. Wow, I'm on a roll here. And what I'm going to do here, for the flat map URL goes into this playlist add source, I'm going to say .catch wrap. Remember, the catch wrap makes it so if an error happens in that location, in that call, it will not terminate the stream, but it'll wrap the error in a result that we can then detect. So let's come back here to Chrome, hit refresh, come in here, add next, and we get unknown error. which is closer, I suppose. Let's go ahead and see why we're getting unknown error. Let's come back into Visual Studio Code, and let's console log result. Let's just log it out so we can get an idea of what's going on. And then we get object with a error equals invalid URL. So I think what's going on there is, I wonder how we did that with our... How did we do that with our chat? I already forgot how we dealt with the chat form error. We did if response and response error, then log out result error message. So what did we do wrong with, or what did I do wrong, rather? I'm not going to blame you guys. What did I do wrong with this compared to chat? So we did throw, observable throw, message is validator message. Oh, I forgot to wrap this in message is validator message. My bad. Okay, so now make sure that you have that. That is the new updated code, which is correct. And I apologize. All right. Let's jump back into Chrome. Let's hit refresh. Now let's add a bogus URL. And we get invalid URL. Awesome. Now let's try to add a actual YouTube URL. And we got nothing. Now, getting nothing is good here. We got nothing because the server didn't respond to this at all. So we didn't know if it succeeded or failed because, well, we haven't written the code on the server to actually process this request. So that's probably a good thing to do. Let's jump back into code. Let's get rid of that logging, that console log result there that I just put in there for debugging. And let's close this out, and let's start talking about how we're going to do this on the server. So opening up our server modules playlist, obviously at some point we're going to add the playlist add method right here. And then that's going to defer into the playlist.js. But what I'm going to do before we do that is I want to stub out our YouTube service. So if you recall, in server.js, we have these video services array, and that's going to have an array of objects that are responsible for not only determining if it's a particular type of video, but also retrieving data about that video or that image or whatever after it's been queued up. So let's go ahead and add a new folder in server, and I'm going to add a new folder called services. And inside of services, I'm going to create a new file called YouTube. Now for YouTube, we're going to do a bunch of stuff, but for now, we're going to just make a sort of dummy YouTube service. And then once we have that done, then probably in the next video or something, we'll fill this out with actual code that hits YouTube and gets information. But let's talk about how these classes are formatted. Basically, I'm going to say export class YouTube service. And he's going to have a process money method that takes in a URL. And then, if this YouTube service returns an observable, it means that this YouTube service has accepted that URL. If it returns null, it means that this service has rejected the URL, and you need to try the next service in the chain. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm just going to arbitrarily accept. I'm going to import observable from RxJS, and I'm going to say return observable. Let's just do of, and we'll say observable of title is blah. Well, how about blah followed by the URL? And then, well, what other parameters do we have on this? Let's see here. We have the title, we have the type, which is simply going to be YouTube. We have the URL, which is, we're just going to pass an URL here. And we have the total time, which will pass in 500. And then maybe we'll add in a delay of 400 milliseconds to simulate latency. So basically what's going on here is we're just immediately accepting the URL and we're passing in some garbage. Now, obviously, we'll write code that actually hits the YouTube API and performs this this stuff for reals, but for now, this will work for our purposes. So let's head on over to server.js, and let's import that at the top. So how about after importing the file repository, we import YouTube service from services YouTube. Then let's scroll down. And for our video services, we'll say new YouTube service. And the video services, if you recall, is passed directly into the playlist modules. Now the playlist module can add videos from these services that we've configured it with. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's jump into modules playlist. And the first thing I'm going to do is add the event handler. Now this event handler is going to be a little interesting. We're going to be doing some simple validation to make sure that the client is currently logged in. But to do that, I'm going to create a helper function. I'm going to say const is logged in equals function of this users dot get user for client does not equal null. So the isLoggedIn function will tell us if the user is logged in or not. It's just a shorthand here, so I don't have to retype in this code all the time. I can just call this function. Then I'm going to add an action handler. I'm going to say playlist::add, and he's going to, again, make sure you use arrow functions here. He's going to take in an object that has a URL, so I'm using object deconstruction there. And the playlist add is going to say, if not, is logged in. Remember, is logged in is a function. It needs to be a function because we need to execute this code, this check, every time we see if we're logged in. If this wasn't a function, then it would never be true because the client's always not logged in the second he connects. So that's why is logged in is a function. We need to recheck every time. Then I'm going to simply say return fail on you must be logged in to do that. Otherwise, return this.add source from URL money URL. So the fail doesn't exist yet. So we do need to import that. And we import that from our, I believe the observable socket. We also need to import our validation. So take a look at this code right here. Just remember, it calls fail if we're not logged in. Otherwise, it returns add source from URL money, which is a function that doesn't exist yet. But let's scroll up to the top and actually import in the things that we need. So after module base, we'll import fail from shared observable -socket. And then we'll also import validate add source from shared, I always forget that. What is that? I need to remember. Validation. Oh, I got it right. Playlist. And validate add source is, I believe, the correct method name. Yes, it is. All right, so now we have validate add source and fail being imported. So now we can work on our add source from URL method. So let's scroll down. Let's do this after set playlist. I'm going to say add source from URL money and URL. I'll say const validator equals validate add source, so we're revalidating the URL. If not validator is valid, then return validator.throw money. And otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to return a new observable. So we do need to import observable as well. So again, let's scroll up to the top. I'm going to import this here at the top. Import observable from RxJS. And then I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to return a new observable that takes in an observer. And the first thing I'm going to do is try to loop through all of my services and try to find a service that's going to accept this URL. So I'm going to say let get source money equals null. And then I'm going to say for let service of this services, which I believe is what I called it. It is. This services, and then I'm going to say get source equals service dot, and I'm going to invoke that, that process method. Remember our process method? I'm going to invoke process money service. And then I'm going to say if get source. So if it returns something, then break out of the loop. So try to get the first service that's going to accept this source. And then if not get source money, then return fail and pass in could not find, or how about no service accepted URL. Otherwise, we're going to say get source money dot do this add source bind this followed by subscribe observer. And then the last thing we're going to do in this video is I'm going to stub out the add source method. So I'm going to say add source source, and we'll just leave it like that. And in the next video, I'll talk a little bit more about what this does right here, and then we'll implement our add source method. So we'll see you guys then.